a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, former president of La Sierra and longtime archaeologist, we talk with Dr. Kent Bramlett, also of La Sierra University, assistant professor of archaeology and history of antiquity, about the rose-red city of Petra, part 5, the later periods of the city's occupation and history. And we do so with a lot of affection for this city. And the part that we encounter, of course, we meet the ancient parts. We love the ancient parts. You walk through the Seek, that crevice that takes us down into the city. We meet the treasury. We think Indiana Jones theme music. But we know the people, too. We think about the Bedouin. We think about the people who lived there, at least lived there, and that we've come to know for long periods of time. That at least is part of one of my memories of Petra.
You know, the Bedouin are so hospitable, aren't they? You cannot visit them in their dwellings or in their tents and so on without them insisting that you accept their hospitality, and they're so gracious. It's a real wonderful experience.
That's standard pretty much throughout the Arab world, isn't it? Wherever you have, well, and it's not just Bedouin. Right. It's in town, it's everywhere. You have this kind of hospitality. Now,
it's too bad that so many Americans, with the recent, troubles and so on, think of terrorists when that is not characteristic of the people that we've come to know in the Middle East.
Not at all. Not even close.
Right.
I mean, these are people who have learned to separate their feelings for us as human beings, and they're always hospitable, from their feelings about governments and what kind of mischief they're up to. But when it comes to human beings, very warm and hospitable. Now, it is true that in Petra, because it's such a huge destination for tourists, that they have learned the tricks of getting people to look at their wares and so on. And so one kind of senses that as well. But the underlying root, genuine hospitality is inescapable. I mean, it's a magnetic force that pulls you. We call it this hospitality vortex that just sucks us into it, because that is exactly how people are. And I think about that with Bedouin cultures in particular, desert cultures in particular. So we think this time about Petra in the later time periods. The interesting ones that we think about archaeologically, even going back to the very earliest, to the Stone Ages, but we think about the Nabateans and all of these carved monuments. We think about the Romans and the temples. We think about the Byzantines and the churches. We want to talk about a part of Petra's history that slips away from Western consciousness, and actually from occupation too. It's very much out in the desert, and it slips away because the economic sources evidently were no longer there. And so we want to talk about the times from the beginning of the Islamic settlements through to modern times, and do so in that way. So we think about the Islamic period, and the Islamic period begins when?
Well, really after Islam spills out from Arabia. So we're talking in the 630s.
So early 7th century.
Right.
I think you have a slide that sort of shows those dates, don't
We're going to come to those dates. In fact, we can talk about that. Before we get to that, let me say this, and then let's make sure we come back to it. But this aerial view of Petra, Wadi Musa, the modern village, named in connection with Moses, and Wadi, the stream bed and spring of Moses, and then the basic area of Petra, which runs right over to where the mountains drop off down into what is called the Araba Valley, or the Great Rift Valley. And then the village of Sehun, we are going to talk about that later in this discussion. and then Beta, the Neolithic site. So we've got the whole time period represented here, but here is the chronology as listed. And you know, it might be interesting to think about this. I just mentioned what normally draws us. Well, we have the Edomites, so the Old Testament or the Iron Age time period, but the Nabateans, they're the ones who left most of these remains. And then we come to the Roman period with the temples and so on. What's happening between these periods and moving toward the red dates that we're going to be looking at? What leads up to these to this transition into the Islamic period? What's happening in the Byzantine period?
Well, there's a real difference, isn't there, between the earlier periods that are represented in black, where the buildings were put up and where there was vibrant government and a lot of what we would call civilization is evident. And then there comes sort of a gap as the trade routes disappear. And the periods that are in the red are more nomadic peoples, tent-dwelling peoples who live there. And the West sort of forgot about this area until it was rediscovered in the 1800s.
So we make this shift. Oh, we should also think about earthquakes.
Yes.
We have serious earthquakes. One's 360?
363. But the tremendous wealth is still flowing through, so it gets rebuilt right away.
It does. And
later on, 749, there's another one, but that's just on the transition into more of the Islamic period. The trade routes have shifted. Of course, the Muslims control the sea routes as well, so there's no necessity to go overland through this part.
And it may be that destructive earthquake, which is evidently fairly severe,
huge,
kind of the capstone, kind of the nail in the casket to Petra's livelihood.
In many places in the southern Levant, or Israel, Jordan, the 749 earthquake destroyed places which earlier would have been rebuilt, but now we have a different political and socio-political culture. The rebuild is in a completely different style. You no longer have the trained guilds to make all these, column capitals and other temple parts.
So there is a lot that's changing here that take us then into the Islamic period. And you talked about the origins. We have on the tables in front of us Islamic pottery, different periods, because we can actually think of Islamic history from the 7th century, early part of the 7th century, up to modern times. I mean, we could really do that. And so talk to us a bit. Kent, you are the typologist. I know that this is not a period that you spend your time in. You work with the earlier periods, the Bronze Ages and the Iron Ages.
Right.
But here we have Islamic pottery. Talk to us a bit about why people can identify these as Islamic.
Well, certainly the lamps develop along this whole trajectory of change, starting as a bowl. We can put a wick in olive oil and burn it, begin to fold the edges over in the Old Testament time period, and then by the Greek and Roman times, they're making them in molds with two pieces, and they're enclosed like this. That continues through the Islamic period. The handles get longer, more like an Aladdin's lamp in these later sorts. So that's one development. But there's something else very interesting. The Islamic world has contact, think of Marco Polo, has contact with China. And in China, they make a different kind of ceramic vessel, one which is glazed. This is completely foreign to the West, the Middle East. About this time, they're making what the Chinese are making a celadon ware. And the Islamic, this is probably Mamluk, later Islamic period.
13th century, 80s, something.
They began to imitate or try to copy the celadon, this glaze. It's beautiful. And they master the technique, and then it appears then throughout the Middle East.
So when we're excavating, if we're at a site that has Islamic occupation, we spot glazeware.
We do.
That's just so giveaways. That's
Yeah,
so much
dead giveaway, as well as certain styles of geometric design.
And this cutware, too, is very characteristic of the Islamic period, where you have, after you've had the vessel fired, they will, and before it's fired, of course, they would cut it away in geometric patterns.
And geometric being characteristic of people who do not want, are prohibited from drawing certainly human figures, animals perhaps.
And some interpretations, any living thing.
And something, any living. So you have a lot of geometry, or geometric figures. And then this is a different kind of thing. It's not ceramic, looks like some kind of derivative of glass, perhaps a frit or something like that. And just a fairly plain bowl.
We'd point out this
Yeah.
flask.
Yeah.
You know, that's a long-lived style. It's a drinking, it's a canteen.
Right.
And I mean, we have these clear back in the late bronze. We're talking time of the Egyptian pharaohs like Ramses. And it continues on down in different decoration styles. This one has a raised relief on it, clear down to the Islamic period.
Right. So to move about in the desert and have some supply, not a large supply with this particular size, but a supply of water that you could take with you and be mobile. So some samples, I mean, there are so many types of Islamic pottery. And Larry, I want you to say a word about the role of Islamic pottery at our excavations at Heshbon, because, or Heshbon, as we've talked about it, because some sort of things happen as we're excavating away, and we have a lot of layers of Islamic occupation. So what happened to that?
You know, you're right. When Dr. Horn chose the site of Heshbon, of course, he was interested in the biblical period and was anxious to get to the Iron Age, which would be the period of the judges, the monarchy, and so on, looking for the city of Sihon, the Amorite that's talked about in the book of Numbers. But as we got started, the latest civilization on the top of the mound was this extensive Islamic period, a period that is characterized by this kind of pottery and this. And so we began getting buckets full of this sort of pottery, which was not really that well known. I mean, everybody knew it was Islamic, but in terms of a progression, you know, and a development, it was not well known. And our site became famous because we dug very carefully and separated the layers and began to realize how from one period it went into another period and so on. And a friend of ours named James Sauer, who was interested in the ceramics, was able to carefully define how this pottery developed from one century to another. And as you indicated, it's one of the major contributions of our excavation at Tel Heshbon to be able to date the Islamic periods.
Right.
Yeah.
Currently, in places across the river in Israel, archaeology is practiced scientifically as anywhere else. But in the past, a lot of people coming from outside of the country looking for the Old Testament or New Testament remains would scrape those Islamic layers off. They just were
sometimes
not
with bulldozers. Even.
I've seen the pictures of the bulldozers. And so for the Heshbon excavation to produce for Jordan the best, most comprehensive typology, we call it, of Islamic pottery. I mean, it was a tremendous contribution to archaeology.
And there's a young woman named Bethany Walker who has eventually sort of grown up, in a sense, with the Heshbon project in its new rendition with Sten LaBianca, and she's become the leading expert on Islamic pottery, now teaches at the University of Bonn, and along with Sten directs the project at Heshbon.
Right. So we keep those connections going.
Right.
And in the process, I think we've learned a lot about these transitions from periods. The monitor here shows us these different periods, and some of them were violent, some of them not so violent, some of them overlapped in interesting ways, and we're going to discover that with the transition from Byzantine into Islamic, and that it didn't seem to be that traumatic, at least in Petra. And why would that be the case, Kent? What would you attribute as reasons for this rather unviolent, more peaceful transition?
Well, I think there's quite a few factors. One is in the nature of the Byzantine administration at that time, filled with inefficiency and controversy. Islam comes in with a clean, simple message: God is one. And at that time, it took at least 100 years for Islam to really develop its own identity. Remember, it's very new. And for really a sort of a distinction, strong distinction between the religions. No, people accepted it as a monotheistic religion. Islam had no grudge against Christianity, saw them as fellow believers. And so it was a change of administration. It wasn't one of killing off the citizens of the cities.
And several of the Byzantine churches that we call Byzantine were actually constructed during the early part of the Islamic period. They were free to allow Christians to build their own churches, and there doesn't seem to be any problem between the two groups.
In fact, at Petra, the main church, which we've looked at in one edition of this program, had seen renovations well into maybe a century and a half into the Islamic periods. So there was a lot more tolerance and collaboration, and we find that to be the case really throughout much of the Middle East.
Almost up until the Crusader period, when those things changed.
Set things on edge
Right,
in a different way.
Right.
Right. So let's then think about some of the Islamic remains, first of all. And we come to this mountaintop. What is this called?
This is the tomb of Aaron, that little white shrine right at the top of Mount Hor, it's called in the Bible, or Jebel Harun, the mountain of Aaron.
The highest mountain in the area.
It is the highest mountain. And remembered from the trip of the Exodus toward the Promised Land and the death of Aaron, I don't know that there's any way definitively to say that this is the
Traditions usually gravitate towards the highest, most prominent
They do, and
feature.
but what it's done, it's saved the memory
It has.
in a graphic way. I mean, you look up there, and if you do like Kent does, you hike up there every time you go.
First thing in the morning, Jebel Harun.
Well, that's the hardest one, and so you go up to the top of that. And I'm not sure people know, at least I haven't found reliable sources that know really when this monument was first started. Could have been started in Christian times, but we do know that there was renovations into the 14th century.
Very likely, because the Christian monks were in the
It's because there was a monastery
Sure.
on the slopes of the mountain too, so we have a lot of that as well. Another indication of Islamic presence, we don't have lots of Islamic buildings. We just don't. And it may be because of the collapse, maybe the earthquake combined with the collapse of trade routes and so on. And at least it seems that it just isn't popular.
As long as we're talking about earthquakes, let's remind people that this is a very earthquake-prone part of the world. Because with plate tectonics theory, the plates are two different plates that meet at this great rift valley that starts down in Africa and goes up through the Red Sea and the Dead Sea and the Jordan River and between the two mountain ranges in Lebanon and clear up into Turkey. So those plates are moving at different rates, and they often produce these earthquakes right along that fault line.
And of course, now we see an illustration of the impact that an earthquake like that would have.
Right. But you're talking about, I think, Arab inscriptions.
Right. That's right. That's okay, though. Good to have these sidebars. We need to have these sidebars. So without a lot of population, did anybody live during these early Islamic periods? It's hard to tell, and archaeologists haven't come up with a lot. But we have found, and this is very recent, around 8 to 10 inscriptions, about 5 of them from early in the Islamic period, from the early Islamic period that we call it, so probably what we would call the Umayyad period, kind of in the beginning of Islam, not too far from the treasury. Removed one small wadi away, but not too far. And these are in what is called Kufic Arabic. And as you've indicated before, not on the program, but beforehand, an animal, there were lots of animal drawings as well. This is one of 5, and these often have a prayer to Allah, to God, and often for protection, but almost always include the request for forgiveness, which is very interesting. I mean, these are places people go, they've marked out that they've been there, they're typically close to sacred sites, and they are asking for forgiveness, which is very interesting. There is another set up on the mountain of Aaron from later periods in the Islamic stream of time. And they represent different time periods, but they also all have a request for forgiveness. Take care of us. We pray for safety for all of the believers, and forgive me for, and then nothing's spelled out. It's just forgive. So this must have been part of the tradition of worship when you go to visit.
Reminds us of some of the Psalms, where David does the same thing.
Right, you have a lot of that tradition. So an interesting part. Again, not much architecture, but inscriptions. Always nice to find inscriptions.
Right.
And these are fairly recent finds. Crusader period. So now if we move to the 11th century, because that's at the end of the 11th century is the first of the Crusades. And evidently, in fact, we have written sources that Baldwin won in the First Crusade.
First king of Jerusalem,
The
right?
first king of Jerusalem made it in 1100 to Petra.
So that's 1 year after they captured
That's
Jerusalem.
1 year after Jerusalem. And I suspect because they wanted to strengthen the southern parts
eastern flank.
of the kingdom, I guess. Yeah, it's,
kingdom.
it's the Holy Land. I mean, that's what it is. That's where we get that term. And so some of the castles are built, the Shobak Castle and the Keret Castle. And evidently Baldwin was only here for a few days, only in Petra. But then within 15 years, you have some Crusader buildings. And they're indicated here. These are not kind of the primary topic of conversation when people talk about Petra, because the remains are so limited. But there are Crusader remains. You remember the map from earlier. Here's Wadi Musa. And on the road up to Sehun, there is a large, probably castle, perhaps fortress of some kind, right alongside the road that is Crusader. And then there is a Crusader building up near the high place. And then I think at El Habis too, down in the lower part of Petra, down in here. So very limited remains. The Crusader times, what did that mean? Was this a peaceful transition? Okay, we have this Byzantine to Islam periods, relatively peaceful. What about the Crusaders? Was that Christianity's best foot forward?
It wasn't, and it's caused trouble ever since, hasn't it? People living in the Middle East today have long memories about how Christians from Europe came and tried to take away their land in a violent way.
And the infidels, destroy the infidels.
Right.
In that whole continuum, we can think about the increasing tensions between the two sides. And there were reports of various sorts of raids on pilgrims as part of pilgrimage anywhere.
Right.
But of course, the Crusaders perceived they were recapturing historic Christian lands, and to avoid presentism, I guess, of putting my perspectives on the past, that was their viewpoint, but it was very violent. It was very different than the initial Islamic conquest. In these battles, cities were massacred.
And even in the Islamic response of Salah ad-Din, the warfare stopped when the surrender was agreed to. Under the Christians, the warfare continued against the infidels until basically everybody's wiped out in Jerusalem. So you know, we have to think about this with eyes wide open. We all come to these events with what some people call a preferred past, the lenses through which we view these events. But I think we have to take those preferred pasts off and look at this more objectively.
I point out that the Crusaders even killed the local Christians in Jerusalem. They didn't want to take the time to sort them out. They said, St. Peter will sort them out at the gates
That's
of heaven.
right, that's right. That's exactly right. So part of an intriguing era in history in the Crusader period. Now we turn to a person, a Swiss explorer, Johann Ludwig
Burckhardt.
Burckhardt, right. What's his story? And we've now moved to the 19th century, early 19th century. What's his story?
Since I think that Kent most represents that kind of traveling travelogue, we ought to ask him to tell the story.
Sometimes I bemoan the fact that all of the truly wild places to discover are gone. I think I can relate with him. He was afraid of the same thing, believe it or not.
Right.
All the great discoveries he thought were being made, and maybe he was left out. So in it was 1806. He's from Switzerland, of course, but he'd heard about the recent discovery of a new big river in Africa, we know it as the Niger River, the third largest one. So he went to England to convince the Society for the Exploration of Africa to support him. Then he goes to Damascus to learn Arabic. He figured that would be a good first step, and stays there close to 6 years, begins making his way south, and happens upon these rumors, legends from the locals about this lost city, as Petra. He either converted to Islam or pretended to convert. There's still debate about his level of sincerity. But local Bedouin guides took him in, and he describes this in his travel log, a wonderful book to read. Going through the sea, seeing the khazanah, the treasury, and his great goal was to find the high place, which he had heard about. He succeeded, but he did have to leave the area because he showed too much interest or too much antiquarian interest, I guess we would say. By the way, he dies at the age of 32 in Cairo from dysentery.
I had occasion, actually it was our mentor, Dr. Siegfried Horn, who assigned to me the task of reading. It was thousands of pages, and I could choose. And so I chose, and I got his book, the 1812, the book on the 1812 visit. It is so exciting to read because he talks about coming into Petra. He talks about wanting to get to the high place. He talks about coming to the last of 3 days, and he had not found the high place, and he was looking for the high place. The sun was starting to go down, and he had a guy with him. He said, "Come over here, check this out," and they finally found the high place. And so he was satisfied. He could actually then die. It didn't take him too much long after that, but he was so pleased. And you read it, and you just sense the anticipation and the wonder as he discovers that. So the discovery of Petra for the West after hundreds of years of abandonment. A couple more things now, more modern, 19th century and now into the 20th century. This particular book by Marguerite Geldermalsen, I think I probably haven't pronounced that entirely well, Geldermalsen.
I think it's a Dutch name, but she actually grew up in New Zealand.
Right. A redhead whom I remember seeing in Petra in the early days. And she wrote this book. Her husband, I think Ali, I think was his name, passed away, but she stayed there. And it's a great story of Bedouin life. And I want to just illustrate some of the Bedouin from Petra, and some of their wares, what they're selling. And then finally, this view of Sehun, where in the mid-1980s, the population of Petra was moved and settled in such a way that it resembled these Bedouin encampments. So, I want to thank you, Kent and Larry, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope this program has provided enlightenment for your mind and food for your soul, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.